Chapter 1. The Morning Star. For thousands of years, humanity looked up at the morning star and imagined a sister planet. Vast oceans and lush jungles hidden beneath a veil of cloud. But the truth was far darker. Venus was not a sister. It was a planetary furnace wearing a pristine white mask, waiting to destroy anything that dared approach. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union looked at that bright point of light and saw a challenge. They would not just orbit the morning star. They were going to land on it. It was an era of supreme engineering confidence. The space race was at its peak. If a machine could be built to survive it, the Soviets believed they could build it. They poured vast resources into a new program. Colossal rockets rolled out into the freezing Siberian winters, and time was of the essence. Launch windows to Venus open once every 19 months. Every missed window surrendered the prize to the Americans. The earliest probes were blind arrows fired into the dark. Sleek silver machines built to cross millions of miles and pierce the clouds of an unknown world. No one knew what waited beneath those clouds. Some predicted a global ocean, others a desert. The sensors were about to return a very different answer. The first probes slammed into the atmosphere and found no water. Only a violent churning ocean of toxic gas, far beyond their design limits. Down on Earth, the telemetry simply vanished. The probes were crushed out of existence before they ever reached the surface. The morning star was a death trap. Chapter 2. A submarine for space. The engineers realized their fatal mistake. Venus did not have a sky like Earth. It had the bottom of an ocean. They did not need a spaceship. They needed a titanium submarine. They abandoned lightweight aerospace design and began forging spherical hulls from thick, heavy metal. Landers built like armored bank vaults. The mathematics were staggering. The pressure was 90 times greater than Earth, enough to crush a military submarine like an empty can in seconds. Every hatch, every seal, every wire was reinforced. Massive pressure chambers were built just to simulate the crushing weight of that alien sky. And the pressure was not the worst of it. One final reading had come back before the early probes died. The surface was nearly 900 degrees, hot enough to melt lead, hot enough to turn zinc into a liquid puddle. Any exposed electronics would simply liquefy on touchdown. The testing was brutal. Thick quartz windows were loaded until they shattered. If a part could fail in the laboratory, it would certainly fail on Venus. The answer was a feat of thermal engineering. Seal the electronics inside the sphere and flood the interior with cooling fluid. A race against thermodynamics. They were not building a machine that could live on Venus. That was impossible. They were building one that could survive just long enough to take a picture. When the new Venera probes were sealed inside their shells, they looked less like spacecraft and more like deep-sea diving bells. Heavy, primitive, built for pure survival. Chapter 3. Firing into the dark. The launch was an exercise in controlled violence. Millions of pounds of thrust, hurling an armored sphere away from Earth and into the freezing void. Behind the fire came months of silence. A long, quiet transit across the solar system, the machine asleep on a perfect trajectory. The rockets performed flawlessly, but crossing the distance was the easy part. The real test would only begin at the atmosphere. Back on Earth, the great dishes turned slowly against the twilight, tracking a speck of metal millions of miles away. Then came separation. The lander detached and fell silently toward the gravity well. From this moment, there was no turning back. The control rooms fell totally silent. The time delay meant whatever was happening out there was already over. They could only wait. The telemetry began to flow. A thin stream of numbers confirming the machine was alive, falling at thousands of miles an hour into a planetary buzzsaw. Below it, a featureless expanse of pale cloud hid a hellscape no human eye had ever seen. It struck the upper atmosphere, and the heat shield began to vaporize, glowing cherry red as it swallowed the raw energy of the plunge. The parachutes deployed with a violent snap. Massive reinforced canopies straining in air that grew thicker and denser by the second. Chapter 4. Descent into the Furnace. Outside the probe, it was raining droplets of pure sulfuric acid, a corrosive mist that immediately began eating away at the exterior sensors. The temperature gauges climbed relentlessly. A suffocating blanket of carbon dioxide had turned the entire planet into a runaway greenhouse. The hull began to warp and discolor. Near the surface, the air was so dense the probe no longer needed its parachute. It simply sank like a stone through water. The altimeter ticked downward, 10 kilometers. 5. The pressure pushed relentlessly against every square inch of the hull. Beneath the clouds there was no sunlight, only a strange, oppressive orange glow. A world without shadows, lit by an eternal furnace. The recording tape spooled on, capturing every agonizing minute, while the scientists watched the pressure readings with absolute dread. Then a heavy, violent crunch. The probe slammed into solid, jagged rock. It did not sink into an ocean. It had survived the fall. The machine was alive on the surface of another planet, and the clock was already ticking. 900 degrees of heat seeping through the hull. Chapter 5. A Glimpse of Hell. The first command fired small explosive bolts, blowing the heavy lens caps away and exposing the camera windows to Venus. The camera was working. Line by agonizing line, a grainy image began crossing millions of miles of space to the waiting screens in Moscow. It revealed pure desolation. Flat, cracked plates of dark basalt stretching to a sharp, curved horizon. The scientists stared in silence at the first photograph from hell. The celebration was brief. The laws of thermodynamics cannot be cheated, and the cold sink inside the probe was already failing. Every exterior sensor was screaming. The wind moved at walking pace, yet pushed with the force of a tidal wave. The acid rain had boiled away before reaching the surface, but the dense atmosphere was already chemically attacking the lander's exposed metal. Inside the sphere, the temperature rose rapidly. The mechanical clocks ticked loudly as the cooling fluid crept toward its boiling point. The control room could only watch the numbers. They were witnessing the slow execution of their own machine. The transmission began to waver. Clean green lines distorting into static as the electronics warped in the heat. Chapter 6. The Inevitable Death. The pressure finally found a weakness. Microscopic fractures spread along the welded seams, letting the heat rush in even faster. Inside, the delicate wiring began to glow. Solder melted, and the circuitry fused into useless puddles of lead and silver. On Earth, the massive antennas strained to hear a fading whisper. Then the feed cut to silence. The machine was dead. On Venus, the blackened sphere sat completely silent among the shattered rocks. A monument to human audacity, left to slowly dissolve. Back home, the formulas gathered dust on abandoned desks. But the program was not over. It was just getting started. Chapter 7. Return to the Furnace. In cavernous hangars, a new generation took shape. Thicker insulation, stronger spheres. Every lesson paid for in melted titanium. They blasted the new hulls with deafening low-frequency sound, simulating the roar of atmospheric entry before it ever left the ground. The new cameras were sealed behind thick quartz pressure windows, polished to perfection to survive both the heat and the crushing depth. Everything, down to a single drop of condensation, was studied, tested, and engineered again. Then the new probes rode fire into the night, lightning flashing across their hulls as they tore through the storm. In darkened rooms, a single bright line arced slowly across the glass, bending toward a distant target. This time, the machines hit the clouds ready. Braking rings snapped open, tearing away the speed of interplanetary transit. Sulfuric clouds streaked the quartz windows with burning liquid. The machines pressed on, and they landed, shock absorbers compressing under the immense weight of the machine and the atmosphere alike. The mission timers began counting. Every single minute on that surface was borrowed time. Not everything went to plan. On one lander, an ejected lens cap fell exactly where the soil probe was meant to strike. A million-mile journey, undone by a bottle cap. But then, line by line, a full-color panorama emerged. Sharp orange rocks stretching to a hazy horizon. Venus in color for the very first time. The surface shimmered through the heat haze, like looking across a river of liquid fire. No test on Earth had fully prepared them for what the machines endured in those minutes. Microphones picked up the roar of the alien wind. For the first time in history, humanity heard the sound of another world. Then, one by one, the thermal defenses collapsed. The cooling fluid began to boil inside the hulls. Transmission dishes drooped as their supports softened in the 900-degree heat, and the cameras cracked, their feeds fracturing into kaleidoscopes of orange shards and static. Chapter 8. The Silence. The tapes ran out. In forgotten rooms, the reels spilled onto cold concrete floors. The last pulse of telemetry faded to black, leaving only the reflection of a stunned technician in the glass. On the surface, the dead spheres are still there, slowly buried by drifting clouds of corrosive dust. From orbit, the yellow clouds are perfectly undisturbed, hiding the crushed remains of the most advanced machines mankind had ever built. On Earth, a pristine silver replica sits in a museum case, under cold, harsh spotlights. The archives remain. Behind heavy doors, the data of a dozen impossible landings, and the photographs, grainy windows onto a world frozen in time. The great dishes still point at the sky, waiting for a signal that will never come again. And on clear nights, Venus still rises, the brightest light in the morning sky, indifferent to the metal corpses resting on its surface. We reached out and touched the morning star. It burned us, and we went back anyway. That is the whole story of exploration, written in titanium on a world made of fire.